membership from doing study commission stuff and all of that. So anyway.
Yeah, I just can't. Not unusual. I should have heard about it.
Really?
Kind of like you. I don't have anything directly to do with it.
But they know you know stuff, right?
Exactly.
Oh, I see. Great.
Conversational.
Right. Well, yeah, she wants to come in and get some talk.
Ready?
I'd like to go ahead and call the meeting to order, please. Okay, for those of you in the audience, I would like to let you know that this is being live streamed, so you will be on TV when you make your statements. And if you notice, this room has a little modification from the last time I think we were here, in that there's no podium to speak from over here. It's in the middle of the room towards the back, so that's where we'll need to have you speak, other than the staff who's doing the presentations. Is that correct, Sheila? That one's lined up back there. Okay, great. Are there any changes or deletions or additions to the agenda?
Mr. Chairman, we have had a request for consent item C for multifamily be pulled from consideration by the respondent, and the staff concurs, and so we would ask that that item in consent, the consent agenda, that is item C for multifamily, be pulled from the consent agenda.
Okay.
I have not heard from any other board members if they have any items they would like to see moved from the consent agenda.
Any board items? Okay, seeing none, we'll accept the motion to pull item multifamily item C.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, moving on. Approval of the minutes. Do
So
I
moved.
have a motion? Have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Are there any discussion, any changes? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, moving on. Public comment. Any public comment? We will have another opportunity towards the end. Okay, great. Legislative update. Trey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, board members. Jackie Peters sends her regrets. She was successful with the birth of her daughter on Tuesday, so that is great news. Everyone is happy and healthy, and she is at home with their new daughter, Adeline, and her family. Again, she sends her regrets, but she should be back to Florida Housing around the time of our June board meeting up here in Tallahassee. So I worked very closely with Jackie and our legislative team. That would be Jennifer Berthume, who also gave birth on Wednesday to her first son. Are you picking up on a trend here? We also appreciate the help of John Toman from the policy group. That is Nancy's shop. We appreciate her giving John, who's sitting out in the audience with us, as he's stepped up as our backup for legislative affairs. I want to go through and talk a little bit about what we accomplished this session and what was not passed. Again, want to commend Jackie and the legislative team for a very successful session. We'll start off with appropriations, and I guess the story that could be told there is that for the longest time, the big issue in Tallahassee were Hurricanes Irma and Maria, in which much of the state saw damage from Irma, and then portions of the state saw a large influx of evacuees from our neighbors in Puerto Rico and the American Virgin Islands. And things were set up, I thought, pretty well for affordable housing funding this year. Unfortunately, on February 14th, as we are all aware, the tragedy at Parkland Florida, down at Stoneman Douglas High School occurred, and the legislature and the governor quickly changed their priorities. The legislature looked to fund $400 million in mental health and school hardening in the budget, and they looked pretty quickly to some of the housing trust fund money that was there, and that's where a good chunk of the $400 million that was suddenly necessary for those issues came from. So the legislature decided to go with the House proposal, which was about $123.6 million for appropriations for housing, and about little over $78 million of that will be for traditional multifamily for sale, and that's broken down with the 47.5 for traditional sale, which includes the link units. They wanted to do $15 million for workforce sale statewide at the 80% AMI level, and $15 million for workforce in Monroe County and the Keys at 120% AMI, which is, I think that is probably the legislature's what they would point to if they had to, if they were cornered on what did you do for hurricane victims. They would point largely to that. There were $25,000 for a study for Florida housing to take a look at early sale payoffs, and we'll see if that makes it through the budget process. That was a proviso. That was a proviso language insertion at the last minute.
And what is that about?
Sure. So that is in regards to, we had heard and seen numerous amendments floating around on the behalf of some developers to deal with, to essentially Florida housing would be forced to take into account different, would be forced to take into account if a developer had paid off their sale loan early. So the legislature decided that they didn't want to make that policy move. So I think as kind of a fallback, the legislature inserted proviso language for $25,000 towards a study on this issue, essentially. Again, I don't know if the governor is going to approve it or not. He has line item veto pen authority. But regardless of whether he does it or not, I think we will be discussing incentives for early sale payoffs when we go into the RFA workshop later this spring. Any other questions on that issue? Then there was also proviso language similar to, actually exactly the same as last year, that prohibits award fundings under certain conditions. So that'll be in the budget and in effect another year. Then there were $44.45 million for the SHIP program, and that included the $500,000 for the Catalyst contract in there as well. There were several bills that Florida Housing was monitoring, and one of them was the affordable housing package that we had been working on since December with Representative Bob Cortez from Seminole County and Senator Keith Perry from Gainesville. That bill started out as Representative Cortez wanted to deal with impact fee waivers and encourage local governments to waive impact fees. The Senate was not particularly inclined to take that language all along, and so the short then that bill got wrapped around the axle with a lot of other issues, including the powers of our corporation, and there were some issues in there regarding long-term affordability of multifamily developments, which we plan to talk about later this summer as well. And they also, some of the best things in that bill would have put the hurricane programs that kind of mirror ship and sail for disasters into statute rather than just in the budget proviso. But since they didn't fund those programs anyway, they decided that the need for that wasn't all that great either way. So At the end of the day, that bill was in play until the final day of session where they were considering policy bills, which was a week ago today, and it ultimately failed and was not considered by the full Senate. There was a budget transparency bill that I believe passed the House, but was never heard in the Senate, so that bill, of course, didn't even get close. That included Florida housing, which included some provisions on budget transparency for you all as board members during our meetings, but about 95% of what the bill was to do, we were already doing internally anyway. But again, the bill was not considered in the Senate, so it died. And then at the end of the day, we had 3 board members, Member Dubuque, Latasha Green-Cobb, and and Creston Leifried. You are all confirmed by the Senate and can move ahead with your terms without any worry. So I'm happy to take any questions about the legislative session. I think that, I think that there was apparently on the table that there was a possibility that housing would have received little to no funding because of the tragedy in South Florida. But they did go to the House position, and we do have, money for our programs, and that is good. We are also looking to do some things internally with what resources we have and how we can maximize those resources in the coming year. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have about the legislative session and how things look going forward. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions? I will like to thank Trey and his staff for working on those bills. I was in touch with Trey quite a bit during the last, I guess, week and a half of session. And I think it brought up some items that we do need to look at, even if they didn't pass through the legislative process. So we'll be getting with y'all to do some workshops and some things to address some of those items and look at them. But great job, and I appreciate everything you did. And I know Hugh was heavily involved with things that were going on. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, really it was all hands on deck at Florida Housing. The legal team, the policy team led by Nancy. Of course, Hugh leads the legal team. And then Angie and Barb and all of the other number crunchers that, where Jackie and I have to have, we have to have numbers yesterday, 5 minutes ago, et cetera. We really appreciate all their patience and hard work in order to make the session successful. And, I also have issues with the properties that we have, and Laura Cox and her team also are extremely helpful. So I just want to mention that, and that it's a team effort, and I'm proud to lead the team. Thank you very much for your help.
All right, moving on to multifamily programs. Marissa?
Thank you. Good morning, Board. The first item on our agenda is the request for applications 2017-113 for housing credit financing for affordable housing developments located in Broward, Duval, Hillsborough, Orange, Palm Beach, and Pinellas counties. Under this RFA, Florida Housing offered $14,601,863 of housing credits to proposed developments located in Broward, Duval, Hillsborough, Orange, Palm Beach, and Pinellas counties. The deadline for receipt of applications was December 28, 2017. Florida Housing received 33 applications in response to this RFA. Our executive director designated a review committee composed of Florida Housing staff, and each member of the review committee independently evaluated and scored their assigned portions of the submitted applications, consulting with non-committee staff and legal counsel as necessary and appropriate. At its February 22, 2018 review committee meeting, the individual committee members presented their scores, and the committee carried out the funding selection process in accordance with the RFA. The 2017-113 all applications chart, which is in your materials as Exhibit A, lists the eligible and ineligible applications. They are listed in assigned application number order. The review committee considered the following motions: to adopt the scoring results set out in your Exhibit A, and then to tentatively select the applications set out in your Exhibit B for funding and invite the applicants to enter credit underwriting. Both of those motions passed unanimously. Our recommendation today is to approve the review committee's recommendations that the board adopt the scoring results of the 33 applications and authorize the tentative selection of the 7 applications set out on Exhibit B for funding. An unallocated balance of $703,863 of competitive housing credit funding remains, and as provided in the RFA, any remaining funding will be distributed as approved by the board. If no notice of protest or formal written protest is filed in accordance with Florida statutes, staff will proceed to issue an invitation to enter credit underwriting to the successful applications. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I hear a motion on this item?
So moved.
We have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Is there any discussion, questions? Okay. Seeing none, we'll call to question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, great, thank you. Next item.
Thank you. The next item is RFA 2017-114, Housing Credit Financing for the Preservation of Existing Affordable Multifamily Housing Developments. Under this RFA, Florida Housing offered $6,665,500 of housing credits to qualified applicants that commit to preserve existing affordable multifamily housing developments. The deadline for receipt of applications for this RFA was December 15th, 2017. Florida Housing received 8 applications in response to this RFA, and the executive director designated Florida Housing staff for review committee members, and each member of the review committee independently evaluated and scored their assigned portions of the submitted applications, consulting with non-committee staff and legal counsel as necessary and appropriate. At its February 22nd review committee meeting, the individual committee members presented their scores, and the committee carried out the funding selection process in accordance with the RFA. The 2017-114 All Applications Chart, which was provided in your materials as Exhibit C, lists the received applications. The applications are listed in the assigned application number order. There were no ineligible applications. The review committee considered 2 motions. The first, to adopt the scoring results as set out in Exhibit C, and then to tentatively select the application set out in Exhibit D in your materials for funding, and to invite the applicants to enter credit underwriting. Those motions passed unanimously. We recommend today for you to approve the committee's recommendations that the board adopt the scoring results of the 8 applications and authorize the tentative selection of the 6 applications set out in your Exhibit D for funding. An unallocated balance of $469,442 of competitive housing credit funding remains, and as provided in the RFA, any remaining funding will be distributed as approved by the board. If no notice of formal written protest is filed in accordance with Florida statutes, staff will proceed to issue an invitation to enter credit underwriting to the applications set out in Exhibit D. And thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do I have a motion for this item?
So moved.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed? You're batting 1,000. Go ahead.
All right, last one. This last RFA item is for RFA 2018-107, Housing Credit and Sale Financing for Affordable Housing for Hurricane Recovery in Monroe County. Under this RFA, Florida Housing offered $2.6 million of housing credits and $10.4 million of sale financing to proposed developments serving the family demographic located in Monroe County. The deadline for receipt of applications was February 15th, 2018. We received 3 applications in response to this RFA. The executive director appointed a review committee meeting composed of Florida Housing, review committee composed of Florida Housing staff. Each member of the review committee independently evaluated and scored their assigned portions of the submitted applications, consulting with non-committee staff and legal counsel as necessary and appropriate. We held the review committee meeting on March 6, 2018, where the committee members presented their scores, and the committee carried out the funding selection process in accordance with the RFA. The 2018-107 All Applications Chart, which is in your materials as Exhibit E, lists the applications. The applications are listed in assigned application number order, and there were no ineligible applications. The review committee considered motions to adopt the scoring results set out in Exhibit E and to tentatively select applications as set out in Exhibit F for funding and invite the applicants to enter credit underwriting. Both motions passed unanimously. Our recommendation today is to approve the review committee's recommendations that the board adopt the scoring results of the 3 applications and authorize the tentative selection of the 2 applications for funding. That leaves an unallocated balance of $2.8 million of sale funding. As provided in the RFA, any remaining funding may be distributed as approved by the board. Therefore, today, staff further recommends that the board allocate the remaining balance of sale funding in this RFA, along with any additional available sale funding and remaining unused credits from other RFAs or a binding commitment off of our 2019 pot of housing credits to authorize the tentative selection of the remaining 3rd eligible application in this RFA. If no notice of protest or formal written protest is filed in accordance with Florida statutes, our staff will proceed to issue an invitation to credit underwriting. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I have a motion on item number C?
So moved.
Motion, how about a second?
Second.
A motion and a second.
Quick question.
Yes.
Did I hear that the recommendation is not the recommendation in the book? The recommendation is to fund all 3?
That's correct. We're going beyond the recommendation that was in the review committee and to recommend the funding of all 3, yes.
So Crystal Cove is the 3rd deal that would be recommended?
Yes, correct. And that was the 3rd eligible application.
Okay. I'm all in favor of producing more units in the Keys, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we have 2 or 3, I'm not sure which, deals teed up for the Keys that need development and viability money, and we need to get those closed. So as long as we have resources to help those Keys deals, which are important to the board and Florida Housing, and they're important to the governor's office, I want to make sure those deals get done in the Keys also, in addition to these 3.
Trey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Barney, I think you raise a good point. I know that with with the storms that have happened, and now I'm hearing stories about lumber and steel tariffs and those issues, other issues taking making effect on the construction pricing. I know we have at least 2 that I'm directly aware of that we awarded in the Keys over the last 2 years, and I agree with you. I believe we do have the resources to move ahead with these 3 deals here, and I hope that we'll do all we can to make sure that the deals we've already committed to can get to closing as well.
Those deals are bigger too, I think.
Yeah, I think those deals are around 100 units each, and whereas these are a little less, around 50. Each
Right.
of these are 50. Yep. So I think I understand your direction from
Okay.
there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, we'll call this to vote. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none? All right, and the next item, which was not in your packet, is more of an informational item, I understand. So go ahead and talk about our plan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. This is just a brief update to let you all know we've started the planning process for our 2018-2019 RFA cycle. Now that we know where we're at with our state appropriations and are anticipating where we're at with our tax credits, we're projecting a similar amount of targeted RFAs that we had in the 2017-2018 cycle with some changes. We're beginning the conversations of how we will incorporate hurricane recovery efforts into our funding. Specifically, we're looking at how we can leverage funding goals for hurricane recovery beyond the workforce funding we'll be receiving for the Keys, which Trey mentioned earlier, into other RFAs. Instrumental to this will be analyzing the hurricane recovery FEMA data that Nancy and our policy folks have pulled together, which includes not only hurricane damage, but Puerto Rican displacement as well. We're also looking at how we will issue our remaining developmental disability RFA funding, understanding that we did not receive additional grant funding from the state this year. Our 2017-2018 timeline that you all approved previously anticipated having a small DD RFA issued in May, and we're going to hold off on doing so just yet until we see what's funded out of the larger developmental disability disabling conditions RFA, which we have scheduled to be issued next week. As we put together a projected RFA timeline for your review. We will also seek input from our developer community at a broader RFA workshop scheduled on May 4th after our next board meeting, which Trey alluded to earlier. We also intend to address methods of RFA scoring at that workshop and seek feedback from the developer community on some of those items as well. And so we hope to have the projected RFA timeline presented to you at the June or July board meeting for approval. And then as a final update, we are still in the rule development process, which you all approved for us to begin at the last board meeting. We held a workshop on February 21st, and we've received many comments and participation from our stakeholders in response to our drafts and the things we're looking at. So that's resulted in us offering an additional workshop March 26th. And we anticipate presenting the notice of proposed rules and QAP for your approval at the May board meeting as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on that? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Seeing none, professional services selection. David, I believe you're up.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a request to go out with a competitive solicitation for compliance administration services for both the single-family homebuyer loan program and the mortgage credit certificate program. So right now we outsource these compliance administration services for our homebuyer loan program. Such services include things like assessing and monitoring lender participation, providing training and technical assistance to lenders, reviewing loan files for compliance with program requirements, data collection and reporting, and providing and maintaining a loan reservation and compliance tracking system. For the mortgage credit certificate program, Florida Housing currently performs all those duties in-house. So right now, our contract with our current provider for services under the homebuyer loan program, who's eHousing Plus, that contract expires on September 30th of this year. We know that eHousing and other likely bidders currently also provide these compliance administration services for mortgage credit certificate programs throughout the country. We're asking for permission for staff to proceed with a competitive solicitation to select one or more qualified firms to provide compliance administration services for the single-family homebuyer loan program and the mortgage credit certificate program. Of course, if the bids we get for the mortgage credit certificate program, don't show any, any gains to be made by outsourcing it, we could always choose not to, proceed with contract negotiations on that part and keep the mortgage credit certificate compliance administration services in-house.
Okay, thank you. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Have a motion, do I have a second?
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Barney, sure, you look like you want to say something. No, okay. All right, if there's no discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, seeing none. Thank you. Before you
Thank you. Yes, sir.
get up, let me ask you for an update on Willie Downs.
Oh, great. Thank you.
We wouldn't want this to be the shortest meeting. I wouldn't want to break Barney's
you
record,
go.
so. But,
Yes, sir. So, after checking with our counsel and our credit underwriter, there is still no 501c3 determination from the IRS, and the loan closing checklists, for both legal and credit underwriting are still quite long. The last I saw from the developer was where they had hoped to be closed by the end of March. Now they're saying probably no earlier than the end of April, but again, that's going to be determined by that 501c3 determination.
okay, expect another question in May on the same thing.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. With that, we'll move for the approval of the consent agenda minus multifamily item C, which was pulled at the beginning of the meeting. Have a motion?
So moved.
Have a second? Have a motion and a second. Latasha, second. All right. If there's no further discussion, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. So moved. Public comment. Seeing no one jumping up, anxious to talk, we'll move on. Again, in an attempt not to break Barney's record, we're going to have a small presentation on the board's role. And I understand this has been done in the past, and Trey is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Wagner is going to talk with us about, have a presentation on the board's role with Florida Housing. Mr. Wagner is a senior partner and head of the housing finance group at Kutak Rock, a national bond counsel firm. In his 40 years as a housing bond lawyer, John has worked with over 35 state housing agencies in some capacity. He was admitted to the Nebraska bar in 1973 after completing his education at the University of Nebraska with his Bachelor of Arts in '71 and his JD with distinction in 1973. Thank you for coming all the way from Nebraska, Mr. Wagner, to speak with us, and we look forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you, Board. Obviously, I'm under a lot of pressure. I understand you want to have the shortest meeting possible.
We're already past that. So
You're already past. Okay, good. And by the way, they were supposed to send you the short bio, not the long bio. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, can you hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the board and the board, how it works together, and also about the organization, because that's important. Now, I think you should have two handouts that I sent down. One is a short one. It's just a PowerPoint of the outline of my comments, and they're the longer booklet, about 50 pages long, which we are not going to go through in detail. You can read that if you want to. A lot of people use it more as a resource. And also because I know you're a sunshine state and you believe in transparency, we are bond counsel for you guys, and we also give a lot of advice to your program people. So I just want you to know that I'm not here pushing us. So I'm going to talk about governance generally. I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of Florida Housing Finance Corporation, because it's important that you understand the nature of the organization that you're governing. Then I'm going to talk about the board members, your role, the interaction, operations, and then we can finish with a little bit about liability and legal duties. But I will try to be fast, and we can do it fast. For what it's worth, in the governance area, things changed in about 2000 or 2002 after the meltdown in the corporate world. Before then, you could be a board member and basically not show up, and nobody would care. But after the meltdown in the corporate world, the Congress held a bunch of hearings, and they kind of redefined the roles and responsibilities of board members on the corporate side. That has now migrated over to the nonprofit and quasi-governmental side, which are people like you guys. And they kind of redefined governance, and they said if you're going to be a board member, you should actually be a board member and not just be a board member in name only. And three of the things that they really pointed out that most boards didn't do a very good job of, and one was understanding the nature of the organization that you're governing. And their point was you can't govern something if you don't know what it's all about. The second thing is that board members need to have training, because most board members don't get training before they go on boards, and you need to know what's going on. And I think about our world of the HFAs, which is kind of a specialized world. You get on the board and you hear all these acronyms. You talk about LIHTC and QAPs and MRBs and bond cap and risk share and stuff like that. Most board members don't know what the heck people are talking about. In fact, the rule of thumb is it takes about a year for a good board member to figure out what they're really talking about, and 2 years at least to really understand it. So if you can do it faster than that, you're above average. Then the last thing that the Congress talked about was transparency. Your state doesn't need any more laws on transparency. You got plenty of that stuff going on, so we don't need to cover that. So let's talk a little bit about what the Florida HFA is. You guys are, and I should say, Florida HFC, because you, of course, changed your name about, 10 years ago now. But you're a unique quasi-governmental organization, not only in your state, but that's true of every state agency. The legislature creates you, they specify your purposes, they give you the powers, but unlike a nonprofit corporation, you're constrained by what they've authorized you to do. If you're on the board of a nonprofit, you could basically do anything that you wanted to unless you were stopped from doing it. So that's an important distinction to understand. Lawyers get into that kind of stuff. The second thing is that you are supposed to be self-supporting, and you are self-supporting, and that's a major aspect of what you have to keep in mind when you govern this organization. Now, you carry out, really, when you think about it, 3 primary types of programs, and if you're in business, you would call this 3 lines of business. One is you carry out single-family programs. You do that with bonds. You do that with a TBA, and again, I assume you know what TBA means, and other types of special single-family programs. The second are multifamily programs, where you're financing with bonds generally, or doing guarantees and things like that. The third line of business is administering various kinds of programs, mostly federal programs, particularly the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is a very, very big deal for every state agency, and particularly in your state. So those are really the 3 lines of business that you're governing in this business of the Florida Housing Finance Corporation. In terms of sources of revenue, because again, you have to be self-supporting, you have to pay for yourself, and you have obligations that go out 20 and 30 years. So when you look at finances, you have to think about the long term, it's not just the short term. You basically have 3 sources of revenue. First of all, you don't get tax money. You may carry out a few programs that are supported by tax money, but if you guys have financial problems, the state has no obligation to come in and help bail you out. You're supposed to pay for yourself. In addition to that, you've got to have enough excess or show enough profit or net worth to go ahead and access the capital markets, because they worry about that kind of stuff. So you have 3 sources of revenue. One is the spread that you earn on your bond programs. When you issue bonds, say at 3%, and you buy loans at 3.5%, you have a little bit of spread, and that's a primary source or main source of your income. This is particularly true on single-family bonds, but it's also true on your multifamily bonds. So spread's important. The second is are the fees that you earn from administering the programs in general. And most agencies really don't make much money, if any, on the fee side unless you have very, very large programs, because it really doesn't cover your overhead. And the third, historically, has been investment income, because you have a lot of money that's invested in reserve funds, like for your bond issues and stuff. And that historically has been one way for you to make some monies, also your general fund monies. The problem, of course, is that the last 5 or 10 years, all of these have been constrained. You also have multiple overseers. There's a lot of people watch what you do and make sure you do it right. The governor and the legislature, obviously. On the federal level, you got the IRS, who looks at your bond issues and your tax credit program. You got HUD, who implements or looks at a lot of your programs. The SEC looks at you every time you're going out and issuing bonds into the public marketplace. And now, of course, you have on the program side that wonderful CFPB. Anybody who's a banker knows that the CFPB is. The good thing is it looks like they're going to be cutting back a little bit, but it does adversely affect you and your administration. You have to worry about the rating agencies and the capital markets generally, because you have to access the capital market to get the money to carry out a lot of your programs. And of course, you always have to worry about the press, and the press rarely writes nice things. They only write things that are scandalous. On the stakeholder side, you have low-income persons that you're supposed to be serving. Obviously, they're very important. Bondholders have a stake in you guys because they have loaned money to you. In some cases, the loans are 30 and 40-year loans. So they worry about how you're operating. Financial counterparties, because a lot of your financial banks and stuff are providing liquidity or lines of credit and things like that, so they worry about you. Nonprofit entities, many of them who are in the housing area, rely on your programs to be there so that they can continue on carrying out their missions. And then, of course, you have private industry partners all the time, that are the lenders, the developers, the realtors, So you have a lot of people who have a stake in what you're doing. The challenges that you have right now, and that every state agency does, is that a lot of what you do is tax-driven. And the federal tax laws have been under a lot of discussion. They're just changing. One of the big issues you have for one of your most important programs, the tax credit program, are what are investors willing to pay for tax credits. And I can tell you that as of right now, the general thinking is that you're going to see about an 8 to 12% decline in the value of the tax credits that you're effectively selling for developers, which means you're going to have less money to play with, which means you have less money to put into programs. That's a major issue, although that's, for what it's worth, it's still being sorted out, but that's an issue for you. And then, of course, on the housing policy side, the federal government has basically been nowhere on federal housing policy, and you hear different things, but they've been giving very little guidance to us who are out here dealing with this stuff. There's a lot of challenges on the federal regulation side. HUD's a mess on the regulation side. It's as simple as that, and they're trying to figure it out. We're all trying to deal with the CFPB, and that's not easy. The SEC and the IRS have always been around. They're looking more at the municipal area, which is what you are part of. The SEC on the bond issue side and the IRS on the audit side. And they can audit your bond programs, they can audit your tax credit programs, so you can't ignore them. You have to be aware of the fact that federal regulation has been a growth area for the feds for about the last 10 or 15 years. Hopefully we're going to see a bit of a decline in that under this administration. Then you have the financial challenges. You have a portfolio runoff. Your single-family portfolio in particular has been running off, and that's where you've been earning a lot of spread. So part of the challenge is to try to maintain or rebuild it. Fortunately, with rates going up, it's getting a little bit better. We've had problems with rate compression for the last 5 or 6 years because part of the advantage that you have is that you can sell tax-exempt bonds and reloan monies at a higher rate. But when rates came way down, taxable rates and tax-exempt rates were right on top of each other, so you were not able to carry out effective programs like you have in the past. And then the last thing, again, is low reinvestment rates. You have reserves, you have general fund monies, and it was great 15 years ago when you were getting 5 and 6%, but for the last 5 or 6 years, you've been getting 1% or less on a lot of this money. So that source of income isn't there. But again, with rates going up, some of these things should hopefully ameliorate a little bit. The last challenge you have is technology. Technology keeps changing. It's expensive. You have to hire more and more IT people to do this kind of stuff. And on top of it, a lot of agencies, I can tell you, are worried about hacking into their systems, so they're spending a lot of money on protection against that. So those are the challenges that you as board members have to kind of deal with. So what's your role as the board? The general thinking is that the role of the board kind of breaks down into several things. One is you're supposed to govern and monitor the organization. What that means is that you don't micromanage, because that's what you have a staff for. You're kind of a macro manager. You should monitor your programs, you should monitor finances, you should monitor management generally. And how do you monitor stuff? Most of the time you do it by getting internal reports. You get internal reports, or should be, about your programs, the single family, how it's doing, the multifamily, how it's doing, and the financial reports to tell you how your organization is doing, whether or not you're breaking even. Are you theoretically losing money, or are you making money and building up more reserves so that you can carry out your programs even better? You get annual audited financials where the auditors come and look at your financials. But my suggestion would be very careful when you look at those, because they follow defined rules on what their numbers say. And the truth of the matter is, GAAP accounting today provides very little information to either investors or board members about how things are really going. In fact, one of my friends who's a CFO and now the executive director of another agency said that auditors often refer to GAAP accounting as goofy GAAP because it doesn't really tell you very much. And so when you look at the numbers, understand that the GAAP numbers that you see from your accountants follow artificial rules in terms of reporting your wealth, your net worth, and so you have to keep that in mind. The best example I can think of is on the single-family side. You guys historically have purchased loans at rates that are below market rates. But if you look at your financials, they will list all those loans at the par amount as being worth that much. If you ever tried to go out and sell those loans in the marketplace, the very day you put them on their books, they're worth about 95 or maybe 90 cents on the dollar. And yet your accounting says that they're worth $1. So that's just a good example of the artificial rules that the accountants are forced to follow, and they follow them religiously. But you as board members need to know that they are not a terribly good guide, and you have to understand what those numbers mean. In fact, most agencies, when they get their periodic internal cash flow reports and budget reports, use basically cash accounting. They don't even use GAAP for internal reports to the board, because the cash accounting is what tells you what's really going on. Also, you're going to get reports from the rating agencies. You ought to read those when they come out. Once a year, they give you an overview of the management of the organization, and that's very valuable, but you have to read between the lines, because they never say anybody is bad, but if they don't say you're very good, then there might be questions about how good you really are. But it is interesting also, speaking with respect to rating agencies and financials, the rating agencies basically don't even use your financials when they look at your net worth. What they do is they start with your financials and they throw out all the stuff that's not real, and that's often quite a bit. And when they actually rate your bond issues, all they look at is cash flow. They don't look at the accounting numbers. So you have to be careful when you look at reports that you get from third parties and understand where they're coming from. You also need to oversee the programs that you're carrying out. The one that's the really big one for almost every state agency, and I know it's a big one for you guys, is the tax credit program and what's in your QAP, because the QAP drives so much of the tax credit programs everywhere. And that is probably the one thing that the boards of most state agencies spend more time on than almost anything else, is trying to figure out what they want in that QAP, because it drives the purposes and the policies that you're trying to carry out. You also need to set policy, and policy is important. It's a big deal to lawyers because it clarifies ambiguities, it sets kind of a baseline for things. It's also helpful, quite honestly, for board members, because it means that if you have a policy on something that was predetermined and something goes screwy, you can say to the press, we had a policy, we thought about it, and the fact that somebody violated the policy doesn't mean that we're not doing a good job. We are doing our job. It's just that somebody violated a policy that we had. So policies are a big deal. They are important. On the other hand, you should also make sure that you periodically review policies. You don't want them to get old. In the booklet, there's a list of suggested types of policies you should have, which can be either formal or at the staff level. But they kind of break down into two kinds of policies. Policies for programs, what's your mission, financial prudence, transparency, that type of thing. And then you need to have a lot of operational policies. Those are things like ethical policies, travel, investment, swaps. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act says you have to have a policy on ethics, which you have basically from the legislature, on whistleblower protection, and on record retention. Those two are basically required by the federal tax laws. The biggest policy issue that we hear discussed, but a lot of people have trouble with, involves social media. And that is when board members or staff are on things like Facebook, do you just put your name on, or do you say, I am John Smith, comma, board member of the Florida Housing Finance Corporation? Because when you put that additional piece on, it gives you additional credibility, arguably, but it also means you're pulling in the organization. And a lot of housing finance agencies have policies against board members and against staff members on Facebook or any kind of social media, putting in the titles or the organization that they work for fear that people are inadvertently or inappropriately leveraging off that information. So it's something to think about. And obviously, with the explosion of social media these days and the way the press uses it, you do have to be very careful with respect to social media.
Do we have a policy like that?
I'm sorry, what?
Does Florida Housing have a policy like that?
That's a good question. Hugh, do you have any, the question is, do we have any policies in regards to social media and board members' activity as it relates to the board?
We have a IT usage policy that, as far as I know, has not been applied to the board.
Okay. We'll take a,
Yeah.
okay, we'll take a look at that, Barney.
So would that even equate to like on LinkedIn where you put organizations you're involved in? You shouldn't be putting Florida Housing Finance Corporation?
You know,
Oh, no, I think that's fine.
yeah, people think LinkedIn is okay because it's a professional thing.
Sign something, it could be
Yeah.
construed that you're representing housing, or you posted your title or whatever. All right.
It's interesting. This just underscores how social media is such a big deal these days. It really is. And by the way, I wasn't trying to create more work for your lawyers here.
He needs some because he doesn't do much.
The last thing that the board is supposed to do or should do is plan. I see you had some planning on here. In the old days, we'd say that boards should have short-term planning for about a year and long-term planning for like 3 to 5 years. Some boards even went out 7 years. With the chaos that's been going on at the federal level for the last, 10 years almost, most boards have abandoned any attempt to really plan on a long-term basis because you just don't know what's going on. It's really hard to plan 5 years out when you don't know what the HUD programs are going to be, when you don't know what the tax laws are going to be, when you don't know what the CFPB is going to be doing and stuff like that. So in terms, if you hear people talk a lot about long-term planning, most agencies give lip service to it, but they really don't do it because it's just almost not possible to do it these days.
I know, excuse me, John, I know that in working with DEO, we have a long-term plan that is posted. I know that was worked on by my predecessor a few years prior to, so I know there is one out there that's posted, and I've reviewed it. But yeah, so welcome your feedback. We'll probably need to look at updating that.
Yeah, if you can do it, good luck. I mean, because it used to be people would say, in 3 or 5 years, we're going to have 3 or 4 more IT people and maybe update the computers once and stuff like that. Who the heck knows what's going to happen because it's happening so fast. So good luck on that. With respect to the board working just generally, the board needs to work as a team. That's pretty obvious. It's true everywhere. It should be pointed out that no individual board member, as a matter of law at least, has any authority. What you really have as a board member is the ability to convince others to join with you. If you can get a majority of the board members to go along with you, then you got total power. But alone, you really don't have any power. I also want to point out, though, that if you are a representative of a particular sector, you have to be a little bit careful. And I know that you guys, some of you board members, are theoretically members of particular sectors. The theory behind that is that you're supposed to know about that sector. You're supposed to be able to tell the other board members about the concerns of that sector and that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that you always vote to favor that sector. When it comes to voting, your job is to vote in the best interest of the Florida Housing Finance Corporation, not that sector. And where we see this come up most often, you would think would be with developers or developer-related people. It's really not. It's mostly a problem when the people are representing the nonprofit sector, because nonprofits are driven by missions, and those people believe in what they're doing. They believe very strongly, and sometimes they have a real hard time separating the strength of that mission purpose for their nonprofit with what they're supposed to be doing at the board level for the organization, for the state agency. But you need to keep that in mind, that you're supposed to be knowledgeable, but that doesn't mean that you vote that way all the time. You're supposed to vote in the best interest of the corporation because that's the board that you're on at that time. Obviously, consensus building is important. It's important to be open and honest with each other. It's important to listen and not talk. Sometimes you have board members who like to hear themselves talk constantly, but people don't hear that very well when they talk constantly. You need to learn to compromise, be informed. Informed people always have more power. One thing that you do have to be careful of, and we hear this from time to time with some state agencies where they have executive sessions and then somebody comes out of the executive session and tells the world about what they talked about. You should not be doing that. Obviously, it undermines the credibility and kind of violates the rule about executive sessions. You should get to know your board members because that helps build collegiality and you can work together better. And it's important to understand that the executive director himself, who may not be a voting member of the board, is really an important member of your board team. Because the truth of the matter is, a board member, you come to a board meeting every month or every 2 months, you get a bunch of information which you may or may not read through, but you really don't know that much about what's going on. On the other hand, it's the job of the executive director to know everything that's going on. And so if you don't access that information from the executive director, it's really pretty foolish of you. And I'm not saying that to make Trey's job easier or harder. It's just true. That's the way you run an organization. You don't have the time to micromanage. That's what Trey's job is to do. So let's talk a little bit more about Trey's job then, because it's important. I mean, one of the key functions you do as a board is you interact with and you work with your executive director. And again, the executive director's job is to run everything on a day-to-day basis, but you got to trust them. If you don't trust them, boy, it's going to be really difficult to govern and manage your organization. And if you think about all the duties the executive director has, there's a lot of them. I mean, they're implementing the board policies, they're representing the HFA in negotiations, they're doing legislative stuff, they're doing budget stuff, they're hiring people, they're firing people, they're doing planning, all this kind of stuff. So they have people underneath them that specialize in that. You also need, as a board, to remember that the executive director is the way that you should be getting information. So you need to tell the executive director what kind of information you need to manage and govern the organization. On the other hand, you also have to be careful not to ask for too much. And you have to be careful a little bit with your executive directors, because I've seen some play games. A friend of mine years ago was an executive director of another agency, and he would send out a 250-page packet for every board meeting. And he said that it was because he was keeping his board informed. But once after a few beers, what he did, he told me, he said, I sent out the big packet because I know they're never going to read all that stuff, but they never can complain because they gave them all the information. And he said it kind of intimidates them, so they won't ask so many questions. So I'm sure Trey wouldn't do that. No way. But on the other hand,
We can have a discussion on the length of the consent items and exhibits.
but you do need to tell them how much you need and if they're giving you too much. And I see that you do have paper. Most agencies have gone to electronic media to disseminate information to the board members.
Go ahead and I'll tell you, they tried that last year.
We tried that.
We're not going to do that, so we might modify it, but go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I've seen people really get buried when they go to the electronic site, because there's no limit in how many electrons you can send out, and you can send out gobs and gobs of paper and just inundate people. Because when you're a board member and you get the packet, part of your job is to look through it and make sure that you kind of thought about stuff. And so if you get too much to do that, you can't do your job. So you do have to watch excess information coming also. The last thing that we always talk about with executive directors is we do encourage boards to annually evaluate their executive director and the job that they're doing. And hopefully, as part of that, the executive director has kind of a job description, because so often the job is so broad, and if it's not somewhat defined, how do you decide whether or not the executive director is doing a good job, and how does he know if he's doing what you need? So you need to have some kind of an institutional mechanism for getting feedback to the executive director, and the best way to do it, generally is through some kind of an annual evaluation. Now, if you're setting the pay level for the executive director, that's often when you would, what you would do is you would tie the pay discussion with the kind of, with the job review. But you should, they kind of owe it, because otherwise what happens after a number of years is people are unhappy with the job the ED is doing, but they never told them that. And so it's important to discuss that. A few minutes about your professional team. You guys do hire professionals, and just so that there's not a misunderstanding, your counsel, whether you're general counsel, your bond counsel, all of us guys, we have legal confidential obligations that apply to you. The investment bankers that you work with from time to time have basically no obligation to you. Obviously, they're going to want you to trust them, and they're going to try to have a trusting relationship. But from a legal standpoint, they don't have any kind of an obligation to you. Your financial advisors, on the other hand, have a fiduciary obligation, which is a very high obligation to you. So your FAs are in a different boat. Your accountants are supposed to be independent, and they go out of their way to be independent these days. And you have bond banks who act as bond trustees and stuff. They're fiduciaries for the bondholders, not for you guys. You're a secondary beneficiary. So you have a lot of professionals, but they operate in different capacities. Okay, I was going to talk, usually we talk a little bit about committees. You guys really don't use committees. I understand you have an audit committee, which most agencies have, and that's because it's very hard to get people to actually pay attention to audits. So if you can find 1 or 2 people on the board who are willing to actually talk to the auditors and interact with them, you set up a committee, you put those people on so the rest of the board members don't have to go through that stuff. But it really is important to try to have 1 or 2 board members who do understand the audits, and will sit down with the auditors and make sure at the audit that you understand what's going on at the audit process. And I see some heads being shaken. Does that mean that you like being on the audit committee, or you don't?
We're actually talking to Creston about becoming a member of the audit committee, so please, if you have any selling points.
You're really selling it for me.
Well, actually, if you like numbers and you want to kind of get into how the numbers aspect, it's a lot of fun. I mean, you just have to expect that there's some artificial rules that they live by. Yes.
Maybe you ought to move on, John.
Okay. Okay, let's talk a little bit about meetings. Probably don't need to talk much to you guys about meetings. First of all, though, it is where your work is all done as a board member, really. So it's important to attend meetings and prepare for meetings and to take part in discussions and all that kind of stuff. Some of the guidelines, which just based upon my observation this morning, you guys are following. You conduct them in a business-like meeting. Sometimes you have board members who like to go on and on and on, and chairs who don't like to restrain them, and those are really boring meetings. You should follow an agenda. You follow an agenda. That's good. You do approve the previous board minutes. That's just a normal thing to do. It's important to do because, and you should read the board minutes before you approve them, because that's the legal record for what you did previously. And if you ever have to get into a courtroom, they will look at the board minutes. They don't look at all the other stuff. So it's important that your board minutes accurately reflect what you did. And you should focus on substantive stuff. You should have a consent agenda. That's obviously what you guys are doing. I mean, so you would be an example of the way to run a board meeting, the way to have an agenda. You're doing all that stuff very, very well. At least you did this morning. Okay, let's talk a little bit about your legal duties and liability, and then we'll wrap it up. Basically, board members have 3 legal duties. One is a general duty of due care to exercise ordinary and reasonable care. This means things like if your legislation specifies that there's something that you have to do, like meet quarterly or something like that, you need to do that. That's a ministerial duty. You don't have any discretion. On the other hand, there are a lot of other duties which are called discretionary, which is like doing things like setting incomes and changing income levels or purchase price levels and making decisions about stuff. There you have lots of authority to decide what you want to do. You should make sure you supervise and monitor the operations. One thing that you should not do is be what they call a dummy director. The best example I can think of is there's a case out of, I think it was Colorado about 10 years ago, where a school board got sued on a harassment thing. And one of the board, and they sued each individual board member as well as the school board itself. And one board member's defense was, he said, well, I didn't go to the board meeting, I didn't engage in any of the discussions, and I didn't read the stuff they sent me. And the court said, there is no dummy director defense. In fact, you are basically, on the face of it, liable for everything because you weren't participating and didn't do your job as a board member. So before 2000, that was actually a defense in the litigation world, is that if you weren't there and you didn't participate and you weren't doing your job, that was okay, you couldn't be liable. The world has changed. So it's an important thing to keep in mind that that's not a defense. Make sure you exercise independent judgment and that any confidential information that's given to you that you keep confidential. The second duty is the duty of loyalty, which means you don't take advantage of opportunities that come to you because you are a board member. When you see something come up in front of the board, if you have a business in that area, you don't go out and take advantage of the fact that you're a board member, and that's pretty basic. One thing that's come up in the last 5 years at the SEC level, for what it's worth, is they've been looking a lot on the corporate world at steering. Steering is when you're a board member and you go to the executive director and say, my friend's an insurance agent, and I'd like to have you buy our insurance from my friend, the insurance agent. Even at the SEC level now, they are going after board members for doing that kind of thing because they think it's a violation of what their duty is. Third duty that you have is the duty of disclosure, and this really comes out of the fact that you're issuing bonds into the capital markets, and what it means is that if you know something that nobody else knows about that could have an adverse effect on things, you need to tell the staff here about it so that they can take it into account if you're doing bond issues. The examples typically are, if you're doing a single-family bond issue and you happen to know, and probably nobody else knows, that one of your important lenders is about to file for bankruptcy, you need to tell the staff here so the staff can assess whether or not that's something that should be disclosed to the public. Same kind of thing if you got a tax credit project that's coming up and you know a developer is about to go into bankruptcy, you need to tell the staff here so they can assess that type of stuff. So that's kind of the duty of disclosure. So then finally, let's talk about the thing that board members do like to talk a little bit about, and then we'll be wrapping it up totally, and that's liability. Because always board members, particularly board members with assets, when they get on a board, one of the first things they say is, well, gee, am I taking on any liability by virtue of this job? And generally, you don't have any personal liability as long as you are doing your job, which means you pay attention at meetings and you use common sense. If you do have issues come up, talk to your general counsel. That's what their job is to help you with those types of things. Sometimes you have state law protection. I don't know if that's true in Florida or not. Some boards carry D&O or E&O insurance. Quite honestly, it isn't worth very much, and it's pretty darn expensive. It's not worth as much because some of the biggest issues that we have these days typically are not covered by that stuff. In fact, the #1 reason for lawsuits against board members these days is harassment, whether it's sexual harassment or racial or whatever. In fact, there's been some pretty large settlements in the last 5 years in that area, most of which do not go public. But insurance typically doesn't cover any of that kind of stuff. So it's something to keep in mind when you look at the cost of insurance. Make sure you look closely at the coverage that you're actually getting and see how much it's worth. One thing you should also have, and you may have it in some states, is by state law, is an indemnification policy, because if you get sued, the real cost is not paying a judgment, because almost all the stuff is settled. The real cost is the fact that if you get sued as a board member, you're going to have to go out and hire a lawyer to protect you. And the legal fees can run up a lot on these kinds of things. And a lot of state agencies, in fact, most of them, if they can, have a policy that they will pay the cost, legal cost or defense cost of board members unless it is proven that the board person really did something that was gross. So you ought to look at that. And by the way, if you look at your financials and then look at the financials of the insurance companies that you might get E&O or D&O insurance from, my guess is that your net worth is probably greater than the net worth of those insurance companies. So think about where you're really getting comfort and protection when you buy insurance. Lastly, don't get too excited if you do end up getting sued. If I remember right, here in Florida years ago, the procedural rules said that if they sued the board, they had to sue every individual board members.
And by Tampa Bay, traffic is light as usual.
Is that for me to end? Anyway, and I know that that was a real problem down here, and they changed the law so you don't get sued individually when they sue the organization, and that's a good thing. But the key thing is people can, for I think it's $35 now, somebody can file a lawsuit against you for darn near anything. That doesn't mean there's any substance to it, so don't panic if that happens. Finally, then, to close, there's always going to be a need for affordable housing. Affordable housing and real estate and housing in general is a huge economic driver. I know it's a very big deal in your state. It has been historically. So what you do is really, really important. The federal government has proven that it's not really good at administering housing programs. In fact, most people would say they're pretty much inept. On the other hand, HFAs have a great history. In fact, you guys were initially created, the very first state agencies were created way back in the early 70s because HUD was doing a poor job on the multifamily side. And HUD has gradually, and the Congress has gradually given more and more authority to organizations like state housing agencies and taken it away from the federal government. The best example was about 5 or 6 years ago when we were trying to get out of the economic mess, and we had some of the special programs. If you noticed, some of those special programs that came from the Congress, they actually went directly to the state agencies. They didn't even go to the state governments for the state governments to pass it down. And that's because you guys have such a good impression. People believe in you on the Hill, or at least they believe you're better than anything else that's around. So your challenge is to keep doing the good job that your predecessors have done for, you know, our kids and our grandkids. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, try to get it done.
Any questions for John? You know, twice, John, during your presentation, you mentioned micromanage, so now I know why Trey wanted you here to talk about that.
I've never
But
gotten
I'm too
paid
old
off.
to change, so you're going to have to live with me, Trey. But thank you. And I'm not sure once your discussion on legal duties and all, how much opportunity we'll have to get new board members. That may have scared a few off. But thank you. It was very informative. And all right.
Appreciate your help, John. Thank you.
Any other business, any other board comments? If not, meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Looking at where our next meeting is?
Right.
Yeah. because I heard you're in there.
Yes, I'm like,
I was afraid he was going to finish.
Yeah. Well, your shortest has been, what, 15 minutes or something, or 30?
No, I think
30?
30 minutes.
30
probably
minutes,
the
yeah.
shortest.